All right, so we're diving deep today into a pretty pivotal moment in the Revolutionary War.
Definitely pivotal moment.
The Battle of Fort Washington,
Yeah.
November 16th, 1776,
Right.
here in New York City.
Right here in New York.
And we've got a collection of historical accounts. And what we really want to uncover is why this battle is remembered as one of the worst defeats for the Patriots.
One of the worst. Yeah.
And what its significance was for the broader trajectory of the war.
Yeah, and I think what's really fascinating about looking back at this battle in particular is we're not just looking at troop movements and, the kind of, fog of war stuff.
Yeah, right.
We're also really trying to look at the decision-making, the strategic thinking behind these decisions.
Yeah.
And, ultimately why this loss was felt so deeply and why it was so impactful on the revolution as a whole. And the material you've gathered, I think, really gets at that. It paints a picture of a battle that was both strategically vital and, as we know, with the benefit of hindsight, marked by some serious miscalculations.
Yeah, okay, so let's rewind a bit and set the scene. It's late 1776.
Right.
The British are fresh off a victory at the Battle of White Plains, and all eyes are on Manhattan Island.
Yeah.
Fort Washington was the last major American stronghold there. Now, there's something really interesting in our sources about General Washington actually giving General Nathanael Greene a discretionary order about potentially abandoning the fort.
Yeah, that's right.
If the situation became too risky.
It was fascinating because Washington always thinking steps ahead, right?
Right.
He saw the danger of having a smaller force potentially trapped and cut off.
Right.
However, Greene, along with some other key officers, like Colonel McGaw, who was the commander at the fort, and General Putnam, they really believed that they could hold it.
Right.
And they felt that maintaining control of that particular high ground was absolutely essential. They argued it could disrupt British naval movements on the Hudson River and maybe even prevent a British attack into New Jersey.
Yeah, when you consider Fort Washington's location, you can see why they felt so strongly about holding on to it.
Absolutely.
It was situated on the highest natural point of Manhattan, up near the northern tip.
Yeah, prime real estate.
Prime real estate.
Yeah.
Right across the river, you had Fort Lee perched on the top of the New Jersey Palisades. So these were supposed to work as a pair, right? These twin forts, to basically create a nightmare for any British warships trying to control the lower Hudson.
Exactly. A total nightmare. I mean, imagine trying to sail through that stretch with cannons booming at you from both sides.
Not a fun day.
Not a fun day at all. And there was this initial sense of optimism. American military leaders like Knox Greene, Heath Putnam, they'd all looked at the situation and said, what a well-defended Fort Washington.
Right.
This is going to be incredibly difficult to take, maybe even impossible.
Yeah, so that kicked off this massive effort to fortify the position, right? We're not talking about just throwing up a simple wooden fence. This was a full-on fortification project.
This was the real deal. They built a cheval de frise in the river.
Was that?
So for those listening who might not be familiar with military engineering, a cheval de frise is basically a big, tangled mess of sharpened logs designed to rip into the hulls of ships trying to pass.
Okay, like an underwater spike strip.
Yeah, exactly. It's brutal and effective. Then on land, they built a pentagonal fort with thick earthen walls and ravelins, which are these angled bastions that project outwards, giving the defenders better fields of fire.
It sounds pretty impressive.
Oh, it was. And the source material really emphasizes the sheer amount of work that went into it. The ground was so rocky, they actually had to bring soil up from lower elevations to even build the walls.
Yeah.
They couldn't even dig proper ditches or trenches because of the bedrock. And then they surrounded the fort with an abatis, which is like this insanely thick barrier of felled trees with all the branches sharpened and pointing outward.
Ouch.
Yeah, you don't want to run into that. But the defenses extended well beyond the fort itself.
Right, so it wasn't just this central five-pointed structure. There were defenses on Cox's Hill, which is key because it overlooks Spuyten and Duyvil Creek, and that controlled the bridges across the Harlem River, like Kings Bridge and Dykeman's Bridge.
And then to the east, you've got Laurel Hill running alongside the Harlem River. And then south of the main fort, they dug 3 lines of trenches and foxholes.
So it sounds like they really had a layered defense system in place.
They did. And on paper, it looked really formidable. But here's a key point that many of our sources highlight looking back. The sheer scale of the area they were trying to defend actually turned out to be a major weakness given how few troops they had to man all of those defenses.
They overextended themselves.
Exactly. It stretched the resources way too thin, and in the end, that played right into the British hands.
So how did the British even get into position to attack Fort Washington in the first place? Can we back up a little bit and talk about their movements after landing on Long Island?
Yeah, absolutely. So after their victory on western Long Island in August of 76, the British, under General Howe, they landed on Manhattan in mid-September.
Okay.
Their initial push northward was actually checked at the Battle of Harlem Heights, which gave the Americans a much-needed morale boost.
Right.
But it was short-lived.
Why is that?
Because Howe, being the clever strategist that he was, decided to change tactics. Instead of trying another direct assault up the length of Manhattan, he landed troops further north in southern Westchester County, which we know today as part of the Bronx.
Okay.
This was a classic flanking maneuver trying to get around the Continental Army and potentially cut off their retreat. It was like in a boxing match when you go for the body shot instead of the head.
A strategic outmaneuver.
Exactly.
And Washington recognized this immediately.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So what did he do?
Well, he had to respond quickly.
Yeah.
He pulled the bulk of his forces north to White Plains. But this is where the situation at Fort Washington gets really precarious, because he left behind a much smaller garrison there, about 1,200 men under the command of Colonel Robert McGaw.
1,200 men.
And looking back, it's clear that this just wasn't enough to hold such extensive fortifications.
Right.
Meanwhile, Howe left a smaller British force under Hugh Percy to watch the Americans who were still down in the Harlem Heights area.
Okay.
So you've got this increasingly isolated American force at Fort Washington becoming more and more vulnerable while the main armies are duking it out up north.
So the stage is set.
Right, the stage is set.
Fast forward to November 16th, the British attack is about to begin.
Yeah.
Talk us through how this unfolded. We know General Howe had a plan that involved hitting the fort from multiple directions.
That's right. Howe's plan was a well-coordinated attack from three sides and a diversionary attack from a fourth.
Okay.
The main thrust was supposed to come from the north, led by Hessian troops. Those are the German mercenaries hired by the British, and they were under the command of Wilhelm von Knyphausen. From the south, you had Hugh Percy leading a brigade of both Hessians and British battalions. And then to the east, Lord Cornwallis with General Edward Matthew and his light infantry, they were to launch their assault.
Okay, so three-pronged attack.
Exactly. And then the diversion, the whole point of which was to distract the Americans and draw their attention and resources away from those main assaults.
Right.
That was going to be carried out by the 42nd Highlanders landing south of the fort on the east side of Manhattan.
And I think I remember reading that the timing of these attacks didn't quite go as planned because of the tides in the Harlem River.
Yeah, that's right. The boats that were supposed to ferry Knyphausen's Hessians across the Harlem to the northern attack point,
Right.
they got delayed coming back to pick up Matthew's troops for the eastern assault.
Okay.
So this meant that Knyphausen's initial attack from the north had to be paused.
So a bit of a lucky break for the Americans.
Though a small one, yeah.
Mm.
It gave the defenders a little bit of breathing room. So around 7 a.m., the Hessian artillery opened fire on the American positions on Laurel Hill. And at the same time, the British frigate HMS Pearl started shelling the American entrenchments.
Okay.
Percy's artillery south of the fort also started targeting McGaw's guns, those American guns that had been harassing British ships in the weeks leading up to the battle.
So right off the bat, the Americans are under fire from multiple directions.
Yeah, they're getting hit from all sides.
But what about the American resistance? How do they hold up, especially on that northern side, against the Hessians?
The initial resistance, particularly on that northern front, was actually pretty strong. When Knyphausen's Hessians restarted their advance around noon, they were met with fierce resistance.
Okay.
Meanwhile, once the tide was high enough, Matthew's troops and even General Howe himself were ferried across the Harlem under heavy fire from the American artillery.
So Howe was right there in the thick of it.
Oh yeah, he was leading from the front. They managed to push their way up the hillside, scattering some American units, until they came to a small fortified position, a redoubt defended by Pennsylvania volunteers, who ultimately had to retreat back towards the main fort.
Okay.
Further north, another Hessian commander, Johann Rall, his troops, they made pretty quick progress up the steep terrain, facing little resistance at first.
Okay.
But then came the main body of the Hessians under Knyphausen advancing down the post road.
Oh.
Yeah, and that's where they ran into some serious trouble.
What happened?
They came under intense fire as they approached this wooded hillside near the fort.
Yep.
It was about 250 riflemen from the Maryland and Virginia Rifle Regiment under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Moses Rawlings.
Okay.
And these guys, they were crack shots, they were experts in using cover and concealment, and they actually managed to drive back the first two Hessian charges, inflicting heavy casualties.
Wow, so they really held them off.
They did for a while. Their accurate rifle fire was a huge obstacle that really slowed down that Hessian advance.
So this is where we hear those really amazing stories of individual bravery, too.
Right.
Like the story of John and Margaret Corbin at the cannon.
Yes, absolutely an incredible story. John Corbin was manning a small cannon on a ridge in an area that's now part of Bennett Park.
Right.
When he was killed during a Hessian assault, his wife Margaret, who had been right there with him throughout the battle,
Oh, wow.
immediately took his place and continued to fire the cannon until she herself was badly wounded.
Wow, that's incredible.
It's an amazing story of courage under fire, and she's remembered as the first known female combatant of the American Revolution.
Amazing. And what was happening on the Southern Front? Was Percy's advance already underway?
Yes, Percy was moving forward in two columns. Hessians on one side, British troops on the other.
Okay.
But he actually paused his main advance to wait for that diversionary attack by the Highlanders to take effect.
To let that play out first.
Exactly. And it was during this pause that the British feint, led by Colonel Sterling and his 42nd Foot, the Highlanders, landed in a less defended section of the American lines. This forced Cadwallader, who was in charge of those southern defenses, to redeploy his troops, weakening his overall position.
I see.
Sterling's men, they were able to scale the heights pretty quickly and overwhelm the American defenders they encountered.
Okay.
So once Percy heard the firing from Sterling's landing, he resumed his advance, putting even more pressure on those already weakened southern defenses.
And the Americans just couldn't hold?
No, they couldn't. The first line of defense had to fall back, and it was around this time that Washington, Greene, Putnam, and Mercer, who had been watching the battle unfold from across the river,
Right.
they realized just how bad the situation was getting, and they crossed back over to Fort Lee.
Oh, so they were watching the whole thing play out.
They had a front row seat to the disaster that was unfolding, and with the outer defenses collapsing on the south and east, a general American retreat towards Fort Washington began.
Okay.
But there was a problem. The third defensive line to the south was actually unfinished. So Cadwallader's men had nowhere else to go but into the fort itself. And up north, Rawlings' riflemen were still fighting like hell,
Right.
but they were outnumbered. Their ammunition was running low, and their rifles were starting to jam from all the firing.
It's falling apart.
Yeah, it's all coming apart. The British frigate HMS Pearl had also managed to knock out the American artillery inside Fort Washington.
So inside the fort, the situation is becoming more and more desperate. What's Washington doing at this point?
Washington, watching all this from Fort Lee, sent a message to Colonel Magaw urging him to hold out until nightfall,
Okay.
hoping that maybe under cover of darkness they could evacuate the troops.
Right. A daring escape.
Yeah, a long shot, but it was their only hope. But by then, the Hessians had effectively cut off the route between the fort and the Hudson River.
So they were trapped.
Completely trapped. Knyphausen, seeing that victory was within reach, gave Johann Rall the honor of demanding the American surrender.
Oh, wow.
A Hessian captain who spoke English and French was sent under a flag of truce to deliver the ultimatum.
And how did those negotiations go?
Not, well, for the Americans. Magaw tried to get better terms for his men, but the Hessians were having none of it.
Right.
He was initially given only half an hour to make a decision.
A half an hour. That's nothing.
It was an impossible situation, and during those tense moments, Washington's final message to hold out arrived, but by then the fort was completely surrounded.
There was no way out.
None whatsoever. So facing overwhelming odds, his defenses in ruins, and no chance of reinforcements or escape, Magaw made the agonizing decision to surrender.
Just a crushing defeat.
The American flag was lowered around 4:00 p.m., and the British raised their colors in its place.
Wow.
There's also that incredible story of John Gooch, who was Washington's messenger.
Right.
He made this crazy daring escape right before the surrender. He actually jumped from the fort and somehow made his way back to Fort Lee.
Oh, wow. So some people did get out.
A handful, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the forces that were involved and the toll this battle took.
Okay.
The British and Hessian forces were a significant size, weren't they?
The British had an elite composite battalion and numerous regiments, the 4th, 10th, 15th, all the way up to the 52nd and Fraser's Highlanders.
Right.
The Hessians also had a sizable contingent.
Okay, and facing them inside Fort Washington.
You had primarily the 3rd and 5th Pennsylvania regiments, the Maryland and Virginia Rifle Regiment, those brave souls,
Yeah.
and some militia from Bucks County.
Okay, and casualty figures.
The British and Hessians lost around 84 killed and 374 wounded.
And the Americans.
The American losses were much, much worse.
Right.
They had 59 killed, 96 wounded, but the number captured was huge, 237 men.
Wow.
And the really tragic part is the long-term impact on those captured soldiers.
What happened?
Conditions in the British prisoner of war camps were absolutely horrific,
Yeah.
and only about 800 of those nearly 3,000 captured Americans survived to be released in a prisoner exchange about 18 months later.
So almost 3/4 of them died in captivity.
It's a staggering loss of life, a human tragedy on a massive scale.
It really puts the human cost of this battle into perspective.
Absolutely. And the strategic fallout of losing Fort Washington was immediate and immense.
Yes.
This victory gave the British solid control over New York Harbor and much of eastern New Jersey.
Right.
Just 3 days later, the Americans had to abandon Fort Lee because it was now completely exposed.
Right.
Washington and his remaining forces were then chased across New Jersey into Pennsylvania, eventually reaching the Delaware River just northwest of Trenton. The British advance was only halted as far as New Brunswick, so you can see how this one defeat could have such a domino effect.
Right. It wasn't just about losing men in a fort.
Yeah.
It was this huge strategic setback for the entire Continental Army.
Exactly. It really put the entire American cause in jeopardy. But then something really interesting happens.
What's that?
This seemingly catastrophic defeat actually sets the stage for some vital American victories.
Okay, so out of this terrible loss comes a glimmer of hope.
Exactly. The desperate situation after Fort Washington falls and the retreat across New Jersey, this becomes the backdrop for Washington's daring Christmas night crossing of the Delaware River and his stunning victories at Trenton against the Hessian forces stationed there, and then shortly after at Princeton.
Right, the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware.
Exactly. These victories, coming after a string of crushing defeats, were absolutely critical in boosting the morale of the Continental Army and the entire Patriot cause.
So a turning point in the war.
You could say that. It shows how even the most devastating losses can sometimes pave the way for future triumphs.
And while Fort Washington was lost, its location was eventually reclaimed by the Americans, wasn't it?
Yes. After the peace treaty was signed and the British finally left New York in 1783, General Washington and Governor George Clinton triumphantly retook Fort Washington as they marched into Lower Manhattan.
A symbolic victory.
Yeah, absolutely reclaiming what was lost.
And today there's a park there, right?
Yeah, Bennett Park in Manhattan, just north of the George Washington Bridge. There are stones marking the outline of the original fort walls and a plaque commemorating its history.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Battle of Fort Washington, it's clear this single battle had a huge impact, both on the strategic landscape and the overall morale of the American Revolution. It was a brutal loss with a terrible cost in human life.
It was.
But as we've talked about, it also inadvertently set the stage for crucial American victories down the road.
It's really quite fascinating when you think about it.
It is.
And it leads to a really intriguing question that I'd like you to consider. How might the course of the entire revolution have been different
Right.
if Fort Washington had somehow managed to hold out? What does this tell us about the real significance of these seemingly localized conflicts and how they can have such a profound ripple effect on the larger currents of history? It's a sobering but ultimately essential chapter in the story of American independence.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us. Until next time.
Zan.